On the afternoon of July 19, 1989, a wide-body airliner prepared for what should have been another routine flight across America. At Chicago O'Hare International Airport, passengers boarded a United Airlines DC-10 bound for Philadelphia, with a scheduled stop in Denver. Families settled into their seats, business travelers opened newspapers, and flight attendants completed their final cabin checks as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Then, without warning, everything changed. A sudden violent explosion echoed through the aircraft. Passengers felt a powerful jolt as the plane shuddered. In the cockpit, warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. The tail-mounted engine had catastrophically failed. But what the pilots didn't yet realize was that the explosion had done something far worse than destroy an engine. Fragments from the shattered turbine had severed all three of the aircraft hydraulic systems. In modern airliners, hydraulics control nearly every flight surface: the ailerons, the rudder, the elevators, the flaps. Without hydraulics, a large aircraft becomes almost impossible to control. And Flight 232 had just lost all of them. The control yokes in the cockpit suddenly felt useless. No matter how the pilots moved them, the aircraft barely responded. The DC-10 began a slow, uncontrollable roll. Captain Haynes and First Officer Bill Records fought to stabilize the aircraft, trying every procedure they knew. But the aircraft was no longer responding like an airplane. It was drifting, falling, sliding through the sky with almost no control. What happened next had never been attempted before in commercial aviation. The crew realized the only way to influence the aircraft direction was through the engines. By adjusting the thrust of the remaining two wing engines, they could slightly change the aircraft attitude. More power on one side would push the plane in that direction. Less power would allow it to drift the other way. It was crude, unstable, but it was the only control they had. As the crew struggled with the impossible task of steering the crippled aircraft, a training captain traveling as a passenger stepped forward. His name was Dennis Fitch. He had experience with the DC-10 systems and offered to help. Captain Haynes quickly welcomed him into the cockpit. Fitch knelt behind the pilots and took control of the throttles, adjusting engine power constantly in an attempt to keep the aircraft level. Together, the four men fought to keep the aircraft in the sky. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, flight attendants prepared passengers for an emergency landing. The aircraft was descending toward Sioux City, Iowa. It was the closest airport with a runway long enough to attempt the impossible. But even with the engines acting as makeshift controls, the aircraft refused to cooperate. It began a slow, relentless turn to the right. Every attempt to correct it only partially worked. The crew could guide the aircraft, but they could not truly control it. Air traffic controllers watched in disbelief as the crippled DC-10 approached Sioux City. The aircraft was descending far faster than normal, and it was still turning. The pilots aimed for the runway as best they could, but the aircraft was unstable, oscillating violently. Inside the cockpit, Captain Haynes spoke calmly over the radio. "We're trying to control it." As the airport came into view, the aircraft rolled sharply to the right. The descent rate increased and the runway rushed toward them. The crew fought desperately to level the wings using the throttles. For a brief moment, the aircraft seemed to stabilize, but it was too late. The right wing dropped. The DC-10 struck the runway hard, the wingtips slamming into the ground. The aircraft cartwheeled across the runway and burst into flames as the fuselage broke apart. Emergency crews who had been waiting along the runway rushed toward the burning wreckage. What they found shocked everyone. Despite the violence of the crash, many passengers were still alive. Out of the 296 people on board, 185 survived. It was one of the most remarkable survival outcomes ever recorded in such a catastrophic crash. Investigators later discovered the cause of the disaster. Inside the tail engine, a tiny crack had formed during manufacturing of a titanium fan disc. Over time, the crack grew, until finally, at 37,000 feet, the disc shattered apart. The fragments severed the aircraft hydraulic lines. This created a failure scenario that engineers had believed was nearly impossible. In response to the crash, major changes were made across the aviation industry. Aircraft designs were reevaluated. Hydraulic systems were better protected, and inspection procedures for engine components became far more rigorous. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Flight 232 was the crew. Faced with a situation no pilot had ever trained for, an aircraft with no flight controls, Captain Haynes and his crew refused to give up. Using nothing but engine thrust and teamwork, they guided a doomed aircraft toward the ground. They gave hundreds of people a chance to survive. In aviation history, United Airlines Flight 232 is remembered not only for tragedy, but for extraordinary courage in the face of the impossible.